Moving now quickly to our third and final presenter, we have Jason Bate from Falmouth University in the UK, where he is a lecturer in practices and histories of photography. So we're broadening our disciplinary frame a little bit even more here. So Jason did his PhD research initially on medical photography, especially photographs taken of soldiers who were disfigured in World War I. In French, they're generally referred to as the gueules cassées, or the smashed faces. And he was interested in looking at this medical photography of disfigured veterans as a historical source. Also, the impact that these photographs have had on our sort of historical, our retrospective historical imagination of soldiers' experiences during the Great War. Today, he's going to be talking about a different but related topic, which is the use of the magic lantern in order as a means of rehabilitating soldiers who had been injured in the war.
Thank you, Brett. Just need to. Okay. Can everyone see my slides there? Yes, you can. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Brett. I'd just like to thank Leen and Brett for kindly inviting me to present at this seminar today. Can you actually see my PowerPoint at the moment? Yes, you can. Okay. And I would just like to warn the audience that some of these photographs that I will be showing are graphic medical images, particularly in the first part of this talk. And my interest in these photographs really stems from the history of photography. And as Brett said, I'm slowly moving into the magic lantern as well, but I'm also very interested in how these technologies merge and how they flow into one another. And through moving into the lantern, I've started to realize that photography or cinematography or the magic lantern is never one distinct and separate technology. These are always very fluid and always evolving, and they're always in conjunction with one another. So this talk revisits the projection services of the Royal Society of Medicine and the Ministry of Pensions in the First World War Britain. And I want to consider the government's rehabilitation schemes for disabled ex-servicemen and the community participations that these fostered in both scientific practices and in public entertainment, and to look at how these activities raised sensitivity to local concerns about war pensioners' reintegration back into society after being injured, how they unleashed expectations about collective sentiment within the community, and intensified discussion about the employability of disabled and mutilated veterans. So I'm currently interested in exploring photographic and lantern practices of the First World War in conjunction with one another, and focusing in particular on the significance of photographers' interactions with other media and technologies on the production of ways of recovering from the war. So I'm very much interested in the performances of these activities in the cinema or in the society meeting room, and particularly the visual practice being described through textual communication. So speaking at the special meeting of a section of odontology at the Royal Society of Medicine on the 28th of February 1916, the president of the British Dental Association in explaining how the section of surgery could establish a working partnership with the odontological section and contribute to the discussion of facial injuries. Harry Baldwin established a role for photography and the magic lantern within the ecology of this group's knowledge of the subject. So these photographs that you can see here, the two albums, these photographs were developed in French war hospitals first, and then the British started copying them. So this first meeting on the 28th of February 1916 was when the British started to realize that they needed to gain a better understanding of these images. So they started to copy the French photographic practices. So Harry Baldwin thanked 4 Parisian doctors for their contribution to an exhibition of material on display at the Royal College of Surgeons Museum, one of which was this album on the left, which showed facial injuries that had been treated in French war hospitals. One noteworthy claim in Baldwin's address suggests that he thought that French and American slides were somehow different from those taken by British surgeons. So if the presentation's success depended on showing lantern slides of a few typical cases that had come under his care to convey to his colleagues his personal view of seeing these patients recover slowly over many months and even years, and being aware that the greatest amount of clinical material available to them was to be seen in France, the success of these British surgeons and of their facial wards depended on the photography of these patients. The experience of photography actually transformed how surgeons studied their patients' treatment and consequently how they wished to represent this experience in the society meetings. So in Britain, Baldwin was not alone in drawing a connection between the surgeons' new experiences of patients and surgery. Many other surgeons were similarly commenting on the influence that photography was having on their visual experiences. Since early 1916, a growing body of British dentists had enthusiastically embraced the magic lantern as it facilitated collaborative and contested debate in immediate exchanges of information and thus early intervention. So in this process, these physical projections shaped surgeons' visual experiences by enabling a new technology-enhanced relationship with the doctor-patient environment in the war hospitals. So it made sense in such an historical moment to refer to the lantern and the camera in conjunction with each other, as these surgeons did, using the projected photographic image as exchangeable and interchangeable for the patient and for the surgeon's experience. So how does our conception of the history of photography change when we erase the boundaries between the camera and the lantern as interrelated practices? In the first part of this talk, I aim to explore the interrelationships between old and new media by questioning photography's place in the context of the social groups engaged in scientific exchanges and the performances of explanation of facial reconstructions that were authorized to make legitimate medical claims through the magic lantern technology. The technological infrastructure of these lantern demonstrations between 1914 and 1919 was adopted and adapted from pre-existing practices, establishing continuity with the long tradition of scientific lectures and the association of glass slides. In the second part of this talk, I want to consider the fraught question of disabled ex-servicemen's future employment that was raised publicly by the Ministry of Pensions in a series of official cinema talks in Britain between 1917 and 1919. The professional lantern lecturer Arthur Malden presented around 200 talks in these 2 years, which combined films with slides illustrating all aspects of the rehabilitation methods and benefits of training schemes overseen by the military. So Malden travelled across Britain, addressing audiences in a vast range of provincial towns and gaining fulsome reviews in local papers. And these performative functions of these educational lectures had to circulate across popular networks and away from the scientific audiences, so as they could build partnerships with the local communities and the relief associations. And the entertainment value had to be present. So there's a tension from the very start here between these very scientific rehabilitative images, but you've also got to make them entertaining so as the public audience will be immersed in these images and also find them interesting. So the Ministry of Pensions was hopeful that they could prompt and ideally enact the compassion of movie-going audiences. So here we can see old and new forms of audience emotions forcefully expressed in old and new media and old and new stage and screen practices. Synchronized projections of photographic slides and films inside a combination magic lantern and cinematograph apparatus. So from 1914 the Royal Society of Medicine's lectures and meeting rooms and its premises at number 1 Wimpole Street in London were at the disposal of medical officers of the army services. Attendance at these meetings was crucial so that existing fellows working in the war hospitals could gather at Wimpole Street to perform efficient lantern demonstrations, interact and discuss their experiences, and use sets of slides to teach the outcomes of experimental surgeries. These meetings were a critical aspect of group participation, which became pivotal in developing and managing the surgical practices in these facial centres, enabling different surgical teams in the war hospitals to contribute in debates over the difficult aftercare of these patients, which spanned several years in some instances. So I'm just going to show some medical records in the medical journals. So speakers use their slides to highlight and explain specific characteristics in types of injury or to contrast the differences in a range of patients so that those present in the meetings could recognise the nature and comprehend these lengthy recovery times. So visual differentiation taught other surgeons how to recognise some of the predictable and therefore the avoidable problems and complexities in treating these particular injuries in advance. Projected images carried enough information for surgeons to be able to assess treatment or plan out their own sessions. Photography came to define surgical activity, showing how much skin, muscle or bone needed to be removed or attached in the operating theatre. The conversations that took place in the society meetings revolved primarily around the usefulness of photography in advancing the lantern effect. The lantern aimed to further temporal and spatial awareness by broadening the scope of photography, to simulate surgeons' everyday experiences of seeing the individual changes in a patient's transformation and to document their healing process. The product of a handheld camera, this instantaneous photography seemingly extended human vision across several months of treatment in the same way in which the lantern was felt to produce the effects of tactile, haptic, and even visceral surgical practices. This allowed surgeons to capture and thus to understand what the camera could only see as before and after exposures, simultaneously inspiring surgeons to think of photography in their hospitals as sequenced and rapidly changing. These pre- and post-operative results could then be quickly collated, published and reported in medical journals. So the war hospitals were being run as a business industry. And like many other businesses, the British Red Cross Society and the Ministry of Pensions actively used projection services to market their facilities, patients, workers, and treatment spaces to help raise public funds to keep the hospitals running. So the state and charities in Britain were instrumental in driving the use of photography, the lantern, and the cinematograph to reinforce its messaging. Equally revealing are remarks in the local press regarding the entertainment value of these military propaganda shows. So numerous reviews of Malden's cinema talks, while declaring that the overall purpose was educational, noted the attractions and theatrics of animated photography, music, song as key features of their programme. For those audiences who reacted the most intensely, the popularity of entertainment spaces like the cinema, theatre and public assembly hall made it easier to connect with and immerse the community spirit. The local community's participation was explicitly desired and also cultivated. So Malden delivered his first lecture on behalf of the ministry at the Kingston Public Library on Monday the 10th of December 1917, followed by fulsome reviews in the Surrey Advertiser and County Times. One local reporter told readers, a series of photographs showing various training centres and disabled men that were or had been trained in occupations demonstrated how veterans could earn a comfortable living over and above the pensions to which their war sacrifices had entitled them. Following a talk at the Cheltenham Hippodrome 2 days later, one reporter wrote in the Gloucestershire Echo, The tragic sadness of seeing groups and processions of men who had lost one leg or an arm, or in some cases both legs, were in a measure relived by the motion films exhibiting the great advance, if not the perfection, of artificial surgery to date. The ministry valued moving pictures for their inherent mechanistic worth over lantern slides, and many films were screened only after the slides had been projected. So these slides' value within this narrative lay in the way that it dealt with the benefits associated with ex-servicemen's regained bodily function. While lantern slides were as useful as films, when it came to questions over the men's independence to earn a good livelihood, a film was placed above a slide as a mode for verifiable visualization of these men's progress. Disabled ex-service workers learning new job skills thus relied on cinematography in making them fit to take a position in civil and domestic life. On the 24th of January 1918 at the Rink Theatre in Wrexham, Lady Trevor, President of the Denbighshire Red Cross, announced amid applause that a disabled man belonging to Wrexham had been trained as a cinema operator and was now employed at the Rink Theatre and would operate the machine for the purposes of the lecture. Among the films exhibited were those depicting the training offered at Roehampton, Brighton, Lord Roberts's workshops and St Dunstan's, together with slides showing Acton Park in Wrexham, where local soldiers were being taught the industry of diamond cutting and polishing. In early February 1918, Maldon gave a series of talks in Scotland, followed by a tour of Wales. Other bookings soon followed, and before the end of the month, he visited Portsmouth, Bristol, Exeter, Portsmouth and Torquay in the southwest of England. On the 17th of February at the Picture House in Portsmouth, one of Maldon's main points of attention was the generous support of its local community. He showered praise on Portsmouth in terms of their moral and material care, as well as their fundraising, and thanked the proprietors of the Picture House for the use of their building. He hoped that these lectures would encourage not only the men to do the work, but to further the efforts by assisting with money and in other ways to get more of these workshops established across the country. There were less favourable opinions on training schemes than this, however, and when a large audience of mainly discharged men gathered at the City Palace Electric Theatre in Exeter on Tuesday the 26th of February 1918, pensioners raised dissatisfaction about the government's training schemes. So emotional was the outpouring of response in Exeter that one disabled veteran in the audience declared these training schemes exploitation. In the words of Mr. C. Oswald, the training given at Roehampton and other centres were not adequate to enable a man to pick up a new trade thoroughly. He was not alone in this opinion, and other protesters soon spoke out. Maldon found himself on the defence and pointed out that these training schemes at Roehampton and Brighton were only of a preparatory character before the men were sent to regional training centres. So at this point, one disabled veteran in the audience echoed the opinion of Maldon and at once recognised his likeness in one of the film scenes of the Roehampton workshop. He called out, "He is Mr. C.W. Jenkins, operator at the Empire Theatre," which was a rival venue in the city, a post which he holds as a result of the scheme, which he then enthusiastically applauds. In March 1918, Maldon travelled back to Scotland to address a crowded Sunday evening audience at the Pavilion Theatre in the town of Hawick in the Scottish borders. As the audience assembled, selections were played by the Pavilion Orchestra, opening with the singing of the hymn, "Our God, Our Help in Ages Past," led by the Hawick Saxhorn Band. In the course of the evening, at the interval and at the close of Maldon's address, several musical numbers were rendered and were much appreciated, and the audience insisted on encores. Maldon brought with him the official ministry films supplied for the region, and he was glad to be able to tell them that he had brought with him a new film which had never been exhibited before, showing what was being done in the southeastern district of Scotland, where 2 Hawick men were being trained. Hawick's manufacturing plants and mills were thrown on the screen and were followed with the most profound interest, a combination of agriculture and craft skills that showcased industry and traditional village life. Significantly, The luxury knitwear industry in this town in the Scottish borders held an especially powerful symbol as a localized and specialized trade. Crucially, the interrelated performativity of images, hymns, classical music, and the national anthem, stimulated in conjunction with the domestic industry of wool manufacture, intensified loyalties to local business, and characterized a remediation of earlier variety entertainments and media forms, which the community obviously knew from religious services and prayer meetings. In October and November 1918, with visits to Sussex, Surrey, and Hampshire in the southeast of England, and to urban centres in the Midlands and the North, Malden addressed ever larger audiences. Yet the training schemes began to generate dissatisfaction amongst trade union members. And this spread to the public and the disabled ex-service community. So the mood really started to shift here at the end of 1918. The main factor contributing to the loss in popularity for these schemes was the low wages and the haste with which these trainees were passed through the schemes. While some men demanded a minimum of £3 per week, irrespective of their pensions, others found themselves out of work and drawing unemployment benefit from the state following their 3 months preliminary training. In March 1919, Malden travelled up to Scotland, then to Sheffield again. And on the 28th and 29th of March, he screened 2 films at the Scala Photo Playhouse in Aberdeen. But these were the last talks that he delivered on behalf of the ministry. The ministry's lectures slowly trickled out of the local press. In the same month, the responsibility for training disabled ex-servicemen was transferred to the Ministry of Labour. 2 months later marked the onset of strike action, as disabled ex-servicemen in training across Britain demanded a minimum of £3 per week, irrespective of their pensions. So in conclusion, since the first experimentations with the camera in the facial wards of French war hospitals in 1914 and 1915, the rapidity of patients being admitted into specialist centres produced in surgeons a desire to consult and photograph them very quickly. New findings of reparative work could then be projected and clarified alongside and to fellow society members, and also extending out from the meeting rooms in the form of cooperation with the library and the reproduction of slides in medical journals. This situated the projector in relation to a visual epistemology and a professionalized practice in modern medicine in the early 20th century. Among the advantages of knowledge sharing was the creation of common standards of best surgical practice in these hospitals, which would then end up having labour and economic benefits, as well as fostering interdisciplinary exchange, just as these medical officers recognised. Whereas in the public sphere, with an emotional culture of sympathy for suffering and disability growing as a result of a close relationship between these hospitals, local charities, the state, photographers, cinematographers, newspaper editors, and picture house proprietors generously placed their services at the disposal of the government to bring these disabled ex-servicemen suffering directly into the civilian community. The government and the British Army were obliged by the competitive market of advertising to attract the attention of disabled British ex-servicemen and to call on the population's emotions to facilitate these men's retraining and employment. And they found the press, photography, the magic lantern, and the cinematograph apparatus, including not only photographs, projectors, slides, films, and screens, but also entertainment spaces, projectionists, lecturers, and musicians as important multimedia weapons in this collective responsibility. Thank you.